Good morning.
Morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Delhi with Sarthak.
That is my name. That's what you're tuned into. And talking books, I tell you, such a pleasurable activity, I tell you. And there's a new book out there for you to read. It's called In the Language of Remembering. It is by Aanchal Malhotra, one of the foremost oral historians that we have, and waving vigorously the flag of youth in a field that is far too often considered mature, so to speak. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but Aanchal Malhotra is with us. Aanchal, being a historian, we've spoken about this earlier, and it bears repeating that it's a double-edged sword to be young in the field of history. You've faced that, the other edge of the sword.
I have sometimes, at least with my first book. I think by now people are more used to the idea of younger historians because there are more of us populating the field.
Of course.
But I think it's actually very important for every generation to have their own historians.
Sure.
To write for their generation.
Absolutely. And that's the thing. I mean, it's very interesting that you use the word language as well in the book because, accessibility has always, like when I was studying history, my inner pseudo was fascinated by words like subaltern history, and it was like you had to use 14-letter words and the whole nuance where everyone would look at you and say, oh, it'll take time for you to understand. But it's wonderful to have a book that has language that's accessible, that's a conversation. It's the kind of language that sort of puts its arm around your shoulder and asks you to sit down and have a cup of tea, which is absolutely wonderful. Did that work against you in academia, so to speak? Were people accusing you of oversimplifying things, etc.?
Not yet.
No?
But I also wouldn't consider myself an academic historian because I don't have that academic training.
Sure.
I come from the world of art. I was a practicing visual artist, and I think I bring that trait to my writing. So it is quite visual in the texture or the language that it uses,
Sure.
Someday maybe I would love to be considered a part of academia. But I do think the work that I do adds to the academic understanding of partition, as I think oral history is now.
Sure.
It is occupying larger space than it was allowed to before.
Absolutely. And also the fascinating thing about, and I've used this word far too often today, a very bad radio, but it's okay. The wonderful thing, the scintillating thing about the books is the covers as well, which you have a big part to play in. So, I just think that far too often the covers of the books are not talked about enough because they're your first point of contact with your reader. So you want to talk to us about the covers of the books that you've chosen?
Yes, again, this comes from my background in the visual arts. I am very invested in my covers because, as you say, they are the first thing that anyone engages with, whether in shop or anywhere. I always wanted my covers to be warm. I think that was the one thing. When you write on partition, it is such a troubling, almost violent episode, but the way in which my perspective on the event is always one of humanity. So you want that kind of humane element to show on your cover, at least I do.
Sure.
With Remnants, the cover was of my grandmother, and it was a photograph that I took almost playfully as a joke, where one afternoon she was wearing this mang tika that her mother had carried from Dera Ismail Khan with the hope to sell it to get money to educate her kids, but she never did, and she gave it to my grandmother as a wedding present. And as a joke, I told my grandmother, "Chalo pehen ke dikhao, how will it look? I want to see." And my grandmother was appalled because she said, I have completely white hair and this colorful jewel on my head looks so out of place. But I think that was the absolute beauty of it. The cover is of her. Her face is cut at the nose, and there is joy you can see through her eyes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, and there is such sort of tenderness and warmth because it is absolutely indicative of the afternoon that we had, playing around, taking photographs, laughing, talking about her mother, topic that she loved to talk about. And I loved that it also showed the object that was carried across the border.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the thing, no? I mean, as they say, the most bewitching smile is the one that reaches the eyes. So,
Yes, absolutely.
non-verbal communication, which is also the shortest chapter in your book about
Right.
silence, which was actually thought-provoking to the extreme. It was. How did you come upon that? I mean, how did you decide to write that chapter?
I think it was always going to be a chapter. Like the silence around partition is as old as partition itself, and it is a way of communication that a lot of survivors practice knowingly.
Sure.
Yes, of course, sometimes we don't have the words to say, and I talk a lot in the book about vocabulary of trauma as well, and the language we use to talk about the past and the traumatic past in particular. But I learned that non-verbal language is also a means to communicate.
Absolutely.
And it is not only practiced by the survivors, but it is also by the descendants. Perhaps because they don't know what to say, they have voids they cannot fill because there is lack of information. And to be honest, when I started putting the chapter together, I always thought it was going to be the longest because so many people had so little to say.
Sure.
But there were so many people that had so little, you know. So I was certain that it would go pages and pages and pages. But as it turned out, it was the shortest chapter because though so many people had so little to say, they had a lot to think about. And these were thoughts they were sharing with me, and research that they had done, or now people go on Instagram and look at geotags of places that their ancestors are from and kind of fill these voids with images and information, which is one of the greatest things about the internet.
I
It's
agree.
the most democratic thing that it can give us,
Sure.
that we can go across the border.
Absolutely.
But the chapter on silence, it was illuminating because I think these were people that, like, the stories included in the chapter were people that really had no access to their past. All links to the past had been tethered. And so when you have no way to get a first-hand account of where your family is from, or where they went to, or what they did, how do you build that landscape?
Sure.
And how do you build that landscape through silence? There is a very in my opinion, one of the most moving interviews, also one of the interviews that made me very sad, is with this young woman who lives in the UK, and she wanted to talk about partition, but she didn't have anything to say. And it should tell us something about partition, why we find ourselves returning to that subject even though we have no words to, personal words, to fill its landscape with. So I would ask her, okay, but where did your family come from? And her parents emigrated to the UK, so she lived there all her life. So she said, I don't know where my grandparents came from. I said, well, where did they go to? She said, I don't know. When did they go? I don't know. When did they, what part of Punjab? I don't know. So, and you could see, like, with every answer there was sort of helplessness. I can't provide this information to you.
Sure.
I don't know if I can, through our conversation, help people to find answers, but at least we are saying things out loud. Things that need to be said out loud. And I think though there was not really any information in that interview, it became one of the most emblematic interviews for me.
Sure.
Because it resonated what so many other people may be feeling. Keep in mind that though this book is quite large and quite comprehensive, it is not a complete study of partition. There are more aspects of memory and more stories that remain unrecorded and unspoken, maybe even unwanted. But people don't know how to deal.
Sure. Of course.
Or they don't have the luxury of time to think about it. Partition, especially in India, it may not be the case in Pakistan, but especially in India, partition is something we can sort of ignore for most of our lives if we don't encounter it.
Sure.
And when we do, it becomes an almost like obsessive, knowing aspect where we have to know where we are from because it is a part of our origin.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you want to know, it's all there. Remnants of a Separation is where you can start and then go to In the Language of Remembering, Aanchal Malhotra. As usual, it has been absolutely brilliant to have had this conversation with you, because it always provides food for thought, which is just such a lovely thing to chew on.
To me as well.
In the morning.
To me as well. I mean, conversations with you always get me thinking about things.
It's a compliment that I take with humility. It's a big one, because if you can make someone think in today's times, that's brilliant. So yeah, this is food for thought. You might want to turn the pages on that. It's called In the Language of Remembering. Aanchal Malhotra, oral historian and waver of the youth flag for history, which is wonderful. So thank you so much, Aanchal.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Delhi with Sarthak.
That is my name. That's what you're tuned into, and we've got the absolutely wonderful Aanchal Malhotra with us, with her sequel for another brilliant book that you should be reading. It's called Remnants of a Separation. It's basically the history of partition through objects, material objects, and the new book is called In the Language of Remembering, which takes that story forward. Aanchal, of course, an oral historian and researcher extraordinaire. Actually, I've been fascinated by the stories that you told us about how you research remnants. And I am on tenterhooks right now to know how you did the research for In the Language of Remembering, because it's brilliant to read the stories, and you know that there's a lot of depth from where the stories come from. So what was that process?
That process was unexpected, I would say, because I didn't imagine so many younger people who hadn't lived through partition wanting to share stories. We always say that, at least I used to always say that partition is a process and it's still ongoing, but I had never spent the time to actually know how and why that was. So, as I said, I was recording interviews alongside Remnants. So it was 9 or 10 years of interviews, I think. And they were interviews in person. There were interviews over email. There were people that would write me messages. There were text messages. There were phone calls.
Wow.
And I am thankfully a very organized person, so I write down every interaction I have with somebody to be able to refer back to it later.
Sure.
So, which meant that sometimes 5 years after I'd met a person, I would write to them and say, hey, do you remember we met so-and-so place at, and you told me this story about your grandfather. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? So I did a lot of this, going back to old material, asking people to elucidate on certain points that they had said casually. And I think the one overwhelming thing that I heard from people was that no one had asked them seriously about partition, because they were the second generation or the third generation or the fourth generation.
Sure.
And, the further we get from the site of memory, we have more, I think we have more clarity.
Sure.
But we have more distance as well from it.
Yes.
And sometimes that distance is good because we are able to see clearly.
Sure.
And so I think a lot of people were thinking about partition more seriously than they ever had, because there were pointed questions about how it made them feel. And there were associations that they created as we were speaking. And I think the one thing I did not expect is to see myself in almost every interaction, to see shades of how I felt, or shades of what my family had told me, or things I hadn't been able to put into words.
Sure.
Through the words of my interviews. And in that sense, I think I'm very grateful to the people that spoke to me, because the openness with which they invited me into their histories is, I don't know if I would have been able to do the same had our roles been reversed.
Sure. There's also this whole thing about the echoes of pain, growing fainter as you said, distance yourself from the memory. There's also this thing that has always been in the back of my mind when I think of partition, which is that for a community experience that a large part of the country experience, it still remains an intensely personal experience, does it not? So was there an echo of community as well in the personal experiences that you heard? Was there a sense of community that you found? I think firstly we have to stop thinking of partition in homogeneous ways. There are so many multiplicities of stories and diversities of stories. So yes, of course, not only was I creating a community, but people were talking about their stories in the context of their own communities as well. There is an excellent example of this where a woman who is an Indian
living in the diaspora in America, she tells me that I'm Sindhi. I'm 100% Sindhi. And again, the Sindhi experience is one that has been researched, but perhaps not as widely as Punjab or Bengal. So she says, I'm 100% Sindhi. And she says that both parts of my family are from Sindh. And I asked a very innocent question to her, that did you know that there were Pakistani Sindhis as well? Because all she had been told was stories of Hindu Sindhis and Sikh Sindhis that had migrated from Sindh to India. But of course, Sindh remains in Pakistan, and there are naturally Muslim Sindhis, Pakistani Sindhis. And she says, I never thought about that until last year. And she's well into her 30s.
Wow, okay.
So I think, yes, there were questions like this. And then there were also people who had themselves researched the story of their family vis-a-vis their community. So they were asking me questions as well. And I think this is why I... in the in the contents of the book, it is conversations on so-and-so topic. It is, I think, by removing the formal word interview and replacing it with a conversation, you immediately become a participant in the process.
Absolutely.
And you become quite invested.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing about a conversation, no? It needs to start somewhere, and it needs to be a little casual as well, no? That's when you...
I think that I embarked on this project searching for answers. Why are we obsessed with partition? Why can't we let it go as South Asians? Why do Indians and Pakistanis fight when in South Asia but become brothers when anywhere else in the world? The greatest paradox there is. Why is the word partition, like when I say the word, I can feel it. Why is it such a deep wound? Why is it persisting? But I think at the end of this book, all I came up with were more questions that other people were asking, or iterations of my questions that they were asking. So I don't know if there are any answers that I've provided per se, but I have tried to show how partition has prolonged itself over the decades.
And that's, and questions. Today asking questions is in itself a very brave act. So thank you very much for the bravery that you've displayed in the pages of the book. It's called In the Language of Remembering. You might want to remember to buy it and read it, because perspectives, they're important. And questions, there are really no wrong questions as long as you're asking them. And what we are asking you to do is stay with us, because there are more questions to ask, and a very, very interesting chapter on silence that we're going to be talking about. It's one of my favorite already. So we'll be talking about that in a bit. If that piques your interest, stay with us right here on 94.3 Radio 1. Books, man. I mean, do you read? It's important to read, because what it does is it gives you perspective and words. Many words that your inner pseudo can then flaunt as wonderful bits of conversation. Polite applause. And someone who's used words the way they're supposed to be used is Aanchal Malhotra. She's an oral historian who's written the absolutely fantastic The Remnants of a Separation. If you've not read it, you should, because it'll give you a perspective of partition that is unique. It's through objects. And now, of course, she's come out with another tome, which is called In the Language of Remembering. I have gone through it in one go. It took a lot of time. I'll have to do a second reading, of course. But Aanchal, as it always is, an absolute pleasure and a joy to have you in our studio to talk about your book.
Thank you so much. And you are the one person who asked the most nuanced questions about my work. So I'm excited to be here.
Remnants, of course, was a unique take in that way. Can we call this a sequel? Would you be comfortable with it being called?
I think technically it is a sequel, because it looks at the generation after Survivors. So it is chronologically a sequel.
Sure. So, did you feel the pressure of or the weight of success that you had tasted with the first book? It was unique, wasn't it? And a lot of people were talking about it. Was this a natural corollary that you thought of while you had finished that first book?
I always think that fame is a very transient concept. It doesn't, you may have it today and not tomorrow. So I try not to take it very seriously, because if you do, then you are not, there's no growth. You don't want to do any better. So the research for In the Language actually began alongside Remnants. I was conducting interviews with children and grandchildren of partition when I was sitting with survivors.
Okay.
So, but I always put it aside as side research because I never thought that anyone would read stories of second-hand memory. Already it was so hard to read stories of partition.
Sure.
So would stories of descendants who have not lived through partition but inherited either stories or silence, would those resonate with people?
Sure.
So it became sort of years of side research, and it was during the pandemic that I was able to sift through it and see the bones of a book emerge.
Right.
And the book was, very simply, it is 75 years on after partition, our descendants, like children, grandchildren, sometimes great-grandchildren, finding ways to connect with partition, and if so, why? And if not, why? So has partition been passed down the generations? Either through politics or through family memory or through heirlooms, as I did in my first book.
For sure.
It was just to see, and also I think to see why I was so obsessed with partition.
Sure. When we live in times where the story of partition is a bit of a minefield, isn't it? I mean, it is. It needs negotiation, so to speak.
Yeah.
Was there ever second thoughts, second guessing about the contents of the book itself? Because it is a big book. Because you've literally poured your heart into the book, and that shows in the soul that it has. Was there second guessing about the subject itself, because the times we live in?
I don't think there was any second guessing, because if anything, the times we live in demand for stories of the past to emerge, to show the parallels that are present in the past and now, and to see how we have not learned from the past and how we can still learn from the past to create a better future. I think that was always very clear for me, that a book like this had to come out as I started putting it together. But I think I never expected it to be as vast as it did and become as autobiographical as it did. I think with Remnants, I was very careful not to let my own voice come through, because these were voices of survivors that we wanted to listen to, voices that had almost never been heard before, in their own words, saying things that they wanted and how they wanted their story to be told.
For sure.
But in this case, when you are speaking to descendants, the past being the past is much harder to substantiate, because you see and you hear how the fault lines from the past have bled into the present, either political, religious, ethnographic, social, linguistic, geographic.
For sure.
And I just, the one thing I took caution with is what words to use when putting the interviews forth, and to make sure that they weren't words that would evoke similarly violent episodes.
Sure.
Or any kind of hate. Because the purpose of books of oral history is to learn from the stories of people, ordinary people.
Absolutely. And that's what it is. In the language of remembering, you might want to pick it up, you might want to read it. It's absolutely fascinating, as is the process, which is what we're going to be talking about. I'm completely fascinated by the process. I cannot but ask you about that when we come back, because people need to know. People need to know that there is grime under the other side of the coin. As you said, the other side of the fame coin is actually grime, and it's always nice to know that. So that's what we're going to be talking about. All you need to do, of course, is not touch that dial. Otherwise, who will be the loser? Think about that.
94.3
One world, your station.